But ultimately, the entire story is about Christ. The entire story is about the redemption of the world. It's about the coming of the Son. And so no matter how important these people might be, some kid might be president that I affect, he's still just a secondary character. Like, he's living in an ark. He might become the most powerful man in the world. He's a little secondary character. Like
in the big story.
In the big story.
I love the way that you help us to think about our lives as a story and learning how to interpret the story that we're in. One of my favorite books that I read as a kid was the Choose Your Own Adventure series of books. And what we love about that is that here we come to this crossroads and we have this great decision to make. And if you make this decision, you go to page 73. If you make that decision, you go to page 84. And it could be your death scene, or it could be a new beginning. And what's cool about what you're saying is that we are in a story right now, and we actually, in some senses, do choose our own adventure. We're partnering with God, who's the ultimate author of the story, right? But he's allowing us to make real choices real time, and that affects the ending of the story.
Yeah, it really does. So he gives us this freedom of operation, and he tells us to write our scenes. Now, so much of it he's writing as well. He's overseeing it, but he lets us write in wet concrete. It's like, I can't go back and edit what I just did in history. I can't go back and edit yesterday. Like, it is. I wrote it in a wet sidewalk, and now it's hard. And he's got me moving on to the next patch of wet concrete. And it's amazing that he gives us that freedom. But the other thing he gives us, and the perspective we need to keep, is that we are secondary characters in other people's stories. And we're all secondary characters in the story. None of us are the hero of the story. We're all secondary characters. And so while we have short stories and arcs and narratives that where we are the lead, like little micro arcs where we're the lead character in a particular incident, it's really important to focus on being a great character in the stories of others. So especially if you're a father, if you're a husband, you think about the fact that the life story of your children starts with, the early chapters are, my dad was horrible, my dad was absent, my dad was always had a short fuse. It's like, or my dad always had time for me. My dad always listened. My dad was loving and kind. And like those early chapters of their life story, it's like, those are for you to write as well. It's terrifying. So not only does God give you freedom to write in your own story, he gives you freedom to write in the stories of others.
For people who think, well, I've just never done anything great in my life. You know, all I did was have kids. No, wait a minute. You are a huge character in a very important story, the lives of your children.
Yeah.
And you're perhaps the opening chapter.
There's a woman who was a young girl, 18, who taught in a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska, who changed my life. Like, I exist because of what this woman did for my grandfather when he was in 3rd grade. You know, it's like, that's like, okay, I don't even know her name. Like, I don't know her name. He had a bunch of illness. He was falling behind. He started thinking of himself as really unintelligent, couldn't do school. She had a one-room schoolhouse, and so she saw this insecure kid, and she focused on him getting up to speed and said, okay, while everything else is going on, I'm going to really work with you, and we're going to do multiple years in 1 year. I'm going to get you up to your age. We're going to make this happen. And she did. He ended up going to the Naval Academy, being a naval officer, meeting my grandmother in Japan. Like, she created a really kind of a legendary guy who was really a great leader in war, a great leader in evangelism. And like, it goes back to this 18-year-old girl in a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska. And you have these formative moments where you decide to be what kind of character in these eternal stories.
Yeah.
And then the downstream consequences are left to God. It's kind of like being Johnny Appleseed in narrative, where you're just going through life and you're throwing seeds and you're throwing scenes and you're just moving through people's lives, and you might be kind of out of focus in the background, barely, or you might have a more, important role. But you're leaving it to God. You're leaving it to the Holy Spirit to do with it what he will in these other narratives. But ultimately, the entire story is about Christ. The entire story is about the redemption of the world. It's about the coming of the Son. And so no matter how important these people might be, some kid might be president that I affect, he's still just a secondary character. Like, he's living in an ark. He might become the most powerful man in the world. He's a little secondary character. Like,
in the big story.
In the big story. And so realizing that that's our job is to image the Son, image the Father in the lives of others as we pass through these scenes. it becomes really potent, it becomes really strong, it becomes highly motivating to not ever snap on an Uber driver, to not ever get frustrated at your kids when they spill milk, to try to write the right dialogue and respond in the right ways when all these provocations come. We live in a moment that's unlike any other moment, a moment of bizarre tyranny, a moment of overreach, a moment of fear. It's like, and how are we living? How are we standing up in this moment? Are we full of joy? Like, are we characters who are full of joy and unafraid? It's like, how do we image God in this particular narrative in which we've been placed in this chapter? And we get trained for that by reading about Sam and Frodo and Aragorn and Gandalf, and reading, Charlotte's Web and Animal Farm, and reading about Prince Caspian. Like, when you're little, you read those things and you read stories when you're older, and it reinforces what is the courageous action of a character in this moment.
Yeah.
What's a sellout? What does it look like?
Nate, Jesus taught in parables, so he loved to tell stories when he was teaching his disciples. I wonder if Jesus were here today, do you think he'd have his own YouTube channel? Do you think he'd have a podcast? Would he have short children's books in Starbucks?
I think he'd be more subversive than that. It'd be hard for me to anticipate exactly what he would do, because I'm trying to make money and pay the bills and do it professionally. He would not be. He would be trying to smash a lot of the infrastructure, undermine a lot of the infrastructure that we've built for ourselves, while living the story he was living. So I think that he'd be teaching with story. I don't think he'd be teaching with story in the professional, within the apparatus that we use ourselves. I think he would control his own apparatus completely. But it is interesting that he tells stories so often. He uses stories to communicate. And he uses stories sometimes to kind of confuse. So we're told that every now and then he tells a story to keep people wondering. Like, it makes them ponder, it makes them wonder, not because it's clear, but because it's unclear. So there's times when you tell a story because you can hit people in their sympathies, and afterwards they have to kind of work through it and figure it out. And there's other times you tell stories to really make it clear. So like Nathan the prophet tells a story to David about the man who steals a lamb. What would you do to this man who steals a lamb? And Nathan uses a story to make it really obvious to David which character he should hate. Like those are those loyalties and those hates. Nathan gets David to hate himself by means of fiction. And Christ does some of the same stuff in parables. Like, where do you put your loyalties? Which things do you love? And so whether it's parables of the talents, harsh master, things like that, he tells these stories, and he tells them to communicate how awful this generation is, to condemn a generation, and sometimes to just make them think and be a little bit confused. But he's constantly telling stories.
Hey, this is Kirk Cameron. Let us know that you like this conversation with Nate Wilson by clicking the like button. Don't forget to share your takeaways from this conversation in the comments below. Don't want to miss future videos? Be sure to subscribe to our channel.